Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Linux Action Show Weekend News Update for the week of October 25th, 2008. My name is Chris. Let's do the news. Some of the big stories for this week's Linux Action Show Weekend Update both revolve around the Ubuntu Linux distribution. First of all, Mark Shuttleworth came out earlier this week and stated that he'd like to see a general rework of the Linux file system. He considers, after evaluating the feedback from new users switching from either no computer in some underprivileged areas or Windows users switching to Ubuntu, that one of their major stumbling blocks is the actual file system. They consider finding files and things like that to be too difficult, and the directories named etc, usr, dev, var, things like that to be confusing. Now, I can see their point, and I realize that there's a certain historical practicalness to having those things around, but perhaps it is time to sort of rework the way that the Linux file system is laid out. Maybe we should go something like along the route of OS X, where the GUI hides some of that stuff from the user, but if you fire up the command line, it's all still there. That kind of seems like a practical way to compromise so you get new user flexibility and ease of use with the old traditional way of doing things just underneath the hood. Seems to work well for OS X. I don't see why it wouldn't work well for Linux. One of the other stories for this week that's going to be kind of big is actually going to be next week's story. Ubuntu version 8.10 Intrepid Ibex is released next week if everything goes as planned. One of the several new features in Ubuntu that I'm looking forward to the most is actually kind of a nerdy kernel level thing. Many of you are probably familiar with the phenomenon when you have a Linux kernel and you've had to maybe build your own ATI drivers or you've had to build your own NVIDIA drivers, you do an update to your kernel and all of a sudden your drivers quit working. Or maybe you have VMware installed and you launch VMware and it says, I need to rebuild kernel modules. Very frustrating, very, very annoying. One of the things that's going to be included in Ubuntu 8.10 is something called DKMS. DKMS, which was developed by Dell and has been run in-house by Dell for quite some time now, is going to allow kernel drivers to be automatically rebuilt when a new kernel is updated. So anything linking into the kernel that doesn't ship with the package from the distribution can automatically be rebuilt. That's going to be huge for video drivers, VMware drivers, special hardware drivers, all those kinds of things that require kernel modules will be automatically rebuilt. Wow. Thank you, Dell. One of the other things, for all of my OCD brothers out there and sisters, the Grub boot menu is finally going to get cleaned up. Now, if you run like a Linux desktop for a while, there'll be several updates to the kernel for security. And then as each kernel version is updated, you get a new line entry in the Grub boot menu when your system boots up. After about 6 months, that can get full of a lot of junk that you're just not using anymore. Now, of course, you could go modify your menu.list for your Grub, and you could clean that up. But really? 2008, do you really want to have to do that? I didn't think so. So what they'll be doing is Ubuntu will be logging the last known good kernel that booted. It will log that and make a menu entry for that. So you will essentially have two entries in your Grub bootloader. You'll have the current kernel from the latest update and maybe a failsafe entry for graphics and things like that. And then only one other entry, last known booting kernel. That is going to be whatever Ubuntu logged as the last successful kernel. So when you do an update, if it fails, you can just select the last known working kernel and your system's back up and running. You no longer have to have almost a dozen entries after 6 months in your Grub menu. Hallelujah. That's a huge improvement. All right, a couple other nice to haves is, of course, the new network manager. The new network manager has a lot of improvements for tethering your phone, your cell phone, things like that. Improvements for VPNs, improvements for people that actually have to log into their DSL line, like with something like PPOE. I know some of us have to do that. Network Manager has improvements for that now. Also, of course, going to be rocking the latest version of Nome, version 2.24. That includes Nautilus with the tabbed file browsing, also quite nice and handy. It's also going to include a newer version of File Roller, the archive and unarchive tool, and it's going to include tar.7z, which is one of the newer formats that's come out over the last couple of years. So that's going to be handy for people that have downloaded those files and been unable to extract them. That's going to be now included by default in File Archiver. One of the other things that's going to be really nice is improvements to server virtualization support in terms of Xen support. They're including one of the Xen management applications that was originally developed by the Red Hat Enterprise and Fedora developers, submitted upstream, and now the Ubuntu people are working that into their distribution. So they're taking advantage of outside resources and bringing it into theirs. That's a great advantage to open source, so I absolutely always love to see when a distribution does that. Something else that's going to be kind of cool is if you're in the right region, is Totem, the movie player, is now going to support the BBC's iPlayer online streaming video, which is great if you've been on a Linux desktop and been unable to watch some of the videos that streamed out by the BBC television network. I don't believe it works for the people in the US, but for those over in the UK, you're now going to be able to watch your BBC content right in Totem, and that's going to be pretty handy. All right, everybody. That's all of the news update I have for this week. Always check out jupiterbroadcasting.com for the big show and for all the other shows we do there. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/ChrisLas, ChrisLas at twitter.com. Hope to see you next week, and be sure, if you like this video, keep an eye out for future content by subscribing to our channel.